Illusion of the Epoch, 20th Century Socialism. Today there is a curious convergence of views between the right and the dominant left on the meaning of socialism. Put more concretely, for both the right and the dominant left, socialism refers to the system which came into being with the conquest of political power by the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917, and signifies a society governed by a single political party, basically the Communist Party, where the means of production are owned predominantly by the state and the economy is directed by central planning. The two most important points stressed by both sides of this socialism are the existence of a single central authority exercising political power and the institution of public property, signifying the replacement of private property in the means of production predominantly by state property. Needless to add, the right looks at this socialism negatively, while the dominant left considers it positively. Both these tendencies, again, find the origin of this socialism in the ideas of Marx. Now that this socialism has almost evaporated, two kinds of responsibility have been attributed to Marx, involving two kinds of criticism of Marx in regards to this socialism. First, it is held that since the inspiration for this system supposedly came from Marx, and consequently, since Marx is thought to be responsible for its creation, its disappearance only shows the failure of Marx's ideas. Similarly, under the same assumption that this socialism was Marx's brainchild, a contrary charge is directed against him. Here the point is stressed that the horrible reality of this system, as shown above in its relation to human individuals, only demonstrates that Marxian socialism by nature is repressive, that is, it is an inhuman regime. The second kind of responsibility attributed to Marx, and consequently, the second kind of criticism of Marx is very different. It involves Marx's prognostication of the failure of the... The second kind of responsibility attributed to Marx, and consequently, the second kind of criticism of Marx is very different. It involves Marx's prognostication of the future after capitalism. The affirmation is made that Marx had envisaged for the future that capitalism, undermined by its own inner contradictions, would go out of existence, yielding place to a new, infinitely more humane society. Socialism has been proved wrong. Capitalism continues to exist in spite of all its ups and downs, and socialism continues to elude us. Marx's vision has simply proved to be unrealizable. At best, it is for the music of the future. Quote. The chapter aims to demonstrate that socialism in Marx is completely different from, if not opposed to, socialism as we find it in its common theoretical presentation, as well as in the practice in socialism's name in the 20th century, and that what Marx had envisaged as socialism has not yet been tried. Second, as regards the alleged failure of Marx's prognostication of society after capital, the advent of socialism in Marx's sense is conditional upon the presence of certain material and subjective conditions which require a prolonged historical period for their fruition within the existing society itself before the new society could appear, for which Marx did not set any calendar. Marx's emancipatory socialist project has lost none of its luster and is still worth striving for. For a proper perspective, we first offer, in what follows, a synoptic overview of socialism as envisaged by Marx. Then we present the specificity of the conception of socialism as it took shape in the last century before proceeding to give a brief account of that socialism in reality. As regards both the concrete and the reality of socialism, as regards both the concept and the reality of socialism in the last century, we consider socialism in Russia after October 1917 as the prototype of all later socialisms. Hence, we first analyze the Russian case at some length, discussing Lenin, then Stalin, and we then offer a shorter account of the next outstanding case, that of China under Mao. We conclude by reasserting the relevance of Marx's emancipatory socialism today. First, a word on the confusion about the term socialism. There is a widespread idea that socialism and communism are two successive societies, that socialism is the transition to communism and hence precedes communism. Later in this essay, we will say more about the origin of this thesis and the consequences of its acceptance. For Marx, this distinction is non-existent. For Marx, socialism is neither the transition to communism nor the lower phase of communism. It is communism, tout court. In fact, Marx calls capitalism itself the transitional point, or transitional phase to communism. For Marx, socialism and communism are simply equivalent and alternative terms for the same society that he envisages for the post-capitalist epoch, which he calls, in different texts, equivalently, communism, socialism, republic of labor, society of free and associated producers, or simply association, cooperative society, reunion of free individuals. Hence what Marx says in one of his famous texts, Critique of the Gotha Program, hereafter Gotha Critique, about the two stages of communism could equally apply to socialism. Socialism or communism appears in two different senses in Marx and Engels. First, as a theoretical expression. In this sense, the term does not mean a state of things which should be established or an ideal to which reality should conform. It is rather the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The movement arises from today's preconditions. Engels says of socialism, communism, quote, "To the extent that it is theoretical, it is the theoretical expression of the place of the proletariat in the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the resume of the conditions of the emancipation of the proletariat," end quote. Again, in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "The theoretical principles of communists are only the general expression of the real relation of the existing class struggle, of a historical movement that is going on before our eyes," end quote. In the second sense, socialism/communism refers to the society which is envisaged as arising after the demise of capitalism. Now, to drive home our point that socialism and communism in Marx mean the same social formation, and thereby to refute the uncritically accepted idea, a sequel to Bolshevism, of socialism being only the transition to communism, we can mention at least four of Marx's texts where, referring to the future society after capital, Marx speaks exclusively of socialism and does not mention communism. Thus, in an 1844 polemic, Marx writes, quote, "Generally, a revolution, an overthrow of the existing power and the dissolution of the old relations is a political act. Without revolution, socialism cannot be viable. Socialism needs this political act to the extent that it needs destruction and dissolution. However, where its organizing activity begins, where its aim and soul stand out, socialism throws away its political cover," end quote. The second and third texts are almost identical, appearing respectively in his 1861 to 1863 notebooks, the second notebook, and in the so-called, quote, "main manuscript" of Capital Volume 3. Here is the 1861 to 63 text in Marx's own English. "Capitalist production is a greater spendthrift than any other mode of production of man, of living labor, spendthrift not only of flesh and blood and muscle, but of brains and nerves. It is, in fact, at the cost of the greatest waste of individual development that the development of the general development of human beings, is secured in those epochs of history which which presage a socialist constitution of mankind." End quote. This text is repeated almost word for word in the main manuscript of the third volume of Capital. Finally, in the course of correcting and improving the text of a book by a worker, Johann Most, meant for popularizing Capital, Marx inserted, quote, "The capitalist mode of production is really a transitional form which by its own organism must lead to a higher, to a cooperative mode of production, to socialism." End quote. The conditions for the rise of socialism are not given by nature. Socialism is a product of history. Quote, "Individuals build a new world from the historical acquisition of their foundering world. Individuals must themselves, in course of their development, first produce the material conditions of a new society, and no effort of spirit or will can free them from this destiny." End quote. It is capital which creates the material conditions and the subjective agents for transforming the present society into a society of free and associated producers. Quote, "The material and the spiritual conditions of the negation of wage labor and capital, themselves the negation of earlier forms of unfree social production, are in turn the results of its, capital's, own process of production." End quote. The material conditions are created by capital's inherent tendency towards universal development of the productive forces and by the socialization of labor and production. As regards the subjective spiritual condition, it is provided by capital's grave-diggers, the proletariat, begotten by capital itself. Even with the strongest will and greatest subjective effort, if the material conditions of production and the corresponding relations of circulation for a classless society do not exist in a latent form, quote, "all attempts to explode the society will be Don Quixotism." End quote. More than 2 decades later, Marx wrote, quote, "A radical social revolution is bound up with certain historical conditions of economic development. The latter are its preconditions. It is therefore only possible where, with capitalist development, the industrial proletariat occupies at least a significant position." End quote. It must be stressed that capitalist relations are not revolutionized within capitalism automatically, even with all the requisite material conditions prepared by capital itself. It is the working class which is the active agent for eliminating capital and building the socialist society. The proletarian revolution is thus an act of self-emancipation. Quote, "The emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves." End quote. Engels equally underlines that, quote, Engels equally underlines that consciousness of the necessity of the profound revolution arises from the working class itself. The starting point of the proletarian revolution is the conquest of political power by the proletariat, the rule of the, quote, "immense majority in the interest of the immense majority," end quote, the conquest of democracy, end quote. This so-called seizure of power by the proletariat does not immediately signify the victory of the revolution. It is only the, quote, "first step in the worker revolution," end quote, which continues through a prolonged, quote, "period of revolutionary transformation," end quote, required for superseding the bourgeois social order. Until capital totally disappears, the workers remain proletarians and the revolution continues victorious, though they are politically. Quote, "The superseding of the economical conditions of the slavery of labor by the conditions of free and associated labor can only be the progressive work of time, end quote. And the, quote, working class will have to pass through long struggles, through a series of historic processes transforming circumstances and men, end quote, wrote Marx with reference to the victory of the Commune. Later, Marx reminded Bakunin that even the installation of proletarian rule, quote, the classes in the old organization of society still do not disappear, end quote. At the end of the process, with the disappearance of capital, the proletariat, along with the proletariat's, quote, dictatorship, quote, end quote, also disappears, leaving individuals as simple producers, and wage labor naturally vanishes. Classes disappear along with the state in its last form as proletarian power, and the society of free and associated producers, socialism, is inaugurated. In all hitherto existing societies based on class rule, the community has stood as an independent power against individuals and has subjugated individuals. Thus, it has really been a false or illusory or apparent community. The outcome of the workers' self-emancipatory revolution is the socialist society, quote, an association of free individuals, end quote. Individuals neither personally dependent as in pre-capitalism, nor objectively dependent as in capitalism. And there arises for the first time the true community where universally developed individuals dominate their own social relations. Correspondingly, the capitalist mode of production yields place to the, quote, associated mode of production, end quote. With the disappearance of classes, there is also no state and hence no politics in the new society. We cited Marx above, holding that with the victory of the proletarian revolution, politics ceases to exist and socialism throws away its political cover. This 1844 position of Marx is repeated in his Anti-Proudhon, 1847, and with Engels in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Following the same logic, Marx and Engels affirmed that the, quote, organization of communism, socialism, is essentially economic. Here the appropriation of the conditions of production is no longer private, it is collective, social. Similarly, with the transformation of society's production relations, its exchange relations with nature as well as among individuals are also transformed. Capital, driven by the logic of accumulation, seriously damages the environment and undermines the natural powers of the earth together with those of the human producer, the, quote, twin foundations of all wealth, end quote. In contrast, in the new society, freed from the mad drive for accumulation and with the unique goal of satisfying human needs, individuals rationally regulate their material exchanges with nature and with the, quote, least expenditure of force and carry on these exchanges in the conditions most worthy of and in fullest conformity with their human nature, end quote. As regards the exchange relations among individuals, the inauguration of collective appropriation of the conditions of production ends the commodity form of products of labor. Here the direct social character of the production is presupposed and hence exchange value ceases to exist. Quote, community is here is posited before production, end quote. From the very inception of the new society, as it has just come out of the womb of capital, Marx's first phase of socialism, quote, producers do not exchange their products, and as little does labor employed on these products appear as value, end quote. Finally, we come to the allocation/distribution of the instruments of production. The material means of production and living labor power, and the consequent distribution of products in the new society. The distribution of the instruments of production boils down really to the allocation of society's total labor time, dead and living. This allocation, effected under capitalism through exchange taking value form, is contrariwise performed in socialism by direct and conscious control of society over its labor time. At the same time, in conformity with the nature of the new society, free time beyond the labor time required for satisfying material needs must be provided by society to the associated individuals for their, quote, all-sided development, end quote. Hence the, quote, economy of time is the first economic law on the basis of communitarian production, end quote. As regards the distribution of the total social product in socialism, it is first divided between the production needs and the consumption needs of society. Production needs here refer to needs of replacement and the extension of society's productive apparatus, as well as insurance and reserve funds against uncertainty. Consumption is both collective, healthcare, education, provision for those unable to work, and personal. The principle governing personal consumption remains that of commodity exchange. The quantity of labor given to society by the individual is received back from society after necessary deductions by the individual. However, the mediating, quote, labor coupons, end quote, have no exchange value. In fact, in commodity production, there is a contradiction between, quote, principle and practice, end quote. Equivalence is established, quote, only on average, end quote, since the individual share in total social labor is unknowable. Opposite is the case with socialism. Similarly, in his famous discussion of the, quote, Association of Free Individuals, end quote, in Capital Volume 1, Marx posits that under, quote, socialized labor, diametrically opposed to commodity production, quote, end quote, the mediating labor certificates are not money. They simply ascertain the share allocated to each laboring individual, quote, only for the sake of a parallel with commodity production, end quote, according to the individual's labor time. At the initial phase of the new society, this principle of equivalence, in parallel with the principle under commodity production, hence called by Marx, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, but without having the value form assumed by the product, cannot be avoided. This process is wholly overcome only at a higher phase of society when all the springs of cooperative wealth open up, leading to the adoption of the principle, quote, from each according to one's ability to each according to one's needs, end quote. Anti-emancipatory character of 20th century socialism. First, a word on the theoretical categories underlying 20th century socialism. These categories, shaped originally and principally by Lenin, developed and perfected later by Stalin. The resulting conceptual framework became, broadly speaking, the heritage of 20th century socialism. Indeed, the theoretical categories of 20th century socialism are only footnotes to Lenin. To paraphrase Alfred North Whitehead on Western philosophy in relation to Plato, they had little relation with the categories that Marx and Engels had put forward in their own presentation of the future society. In fact, 20th century socialism's theoretical representation of the post-capitalist society shows a near-complete revision, in Lenin's precise sense of the term, of Marx's ideas. As regards the conditions for socialist revolution, Lenin advanced two important arguments for socialist revolution in Russia after the February Revolution. As regards the conditions for socialist revolution, Lenin advanced two important arguments for socialist revolution in Russia after the February uprising of 1917. First, a few months before the seizure of power, Lenin affirmed that as a result of the February Revolution, state power in Russia had passed into the hands of the bourgeoisie and the landlords turned bourgeoisie. Quote, to this extent, the bourgeois revolution is completed, end quote. Shortly afterwards, Lenin asserted, without any qualification this time, quote, the bourgeois revolution is already completed, End quote. The second argument for a successful socialist revolution in backward Russia, already implicit in Lenin's 1915 declaration on the possibility of socialist revolution outside Europe, given, quote, unequal development of capitalism, end quote, was explicitly made only a few months after the October seizure of power. It was easier, quote, for the socialist revolutionary movement to start, quote, end quote, in a backward capitalist country like Russia. Quote, things had worked out differently from what Marx and Engels had expected. To paraphrase Keynes' statement about Ricardo, Lenin conquered not only the revolutionary left, but also some of the lucid moments of the 20th century as completely as the Inquisition had conquered. Jesus Christ. To paraphrase Keynes' statement about Ricardo, Lenin conquered not only the revolutionary left, but also some of the lucid minds of the 20th century as completely as the Inquisition had conquered Spain. They thought without question that a socialist revolution had indeed taken place and been victorious in one of the most backward capitalist countries, thereby disproving Marx's prognostication. Thus, E.H. Carr thought that, quote, the Marxist scheme of revolution was bound to break down when the proletarian revolution occurred in the most backward capitalist country, end quote. In his turn, Isaac Deutscher wrote that it was the Russian Marxists, and not Marx and Engels, whom the events in Russia proved to be right. In the same way, Paul Sweezy opined, quote, the revolutions that put socialism in history's agenda took place not in economically developed countries, as Marx and Engels thought they would, but in countries where capitalism was still in early stages, end quote. The position of these people confirms what Marx and Engels noted in an earlier text, quote, while in daily life every shopkeeper knows very well the distinction between what a person claims to be and what he or she really is, our historiography has not yet come to know this triviality. It takes at its word what each epoch affirms and imagines itself to be. End quote. Sorry, everybody. Both the arguments of Lenin in favor of socialist revolution in Russia in 1917 were a radical revision of the materialist conception of history. As regards the first argument, Lenin predicated the, quote, completion, end quote, of the bourgeois democratic revolution simply on the basis of the passage to political power of the bourgeoisie, independently of the question of any change in the social relations of production in Russia, whereas for Marx only a radical transformation of these relations, and not a mere change in political power, would signify completion of a social, including bourgeois revolution. As Lenin's second argument mentioned above, the fundamental question is, even assuming the presence of the revolutionary class, the proletariat, whether it is possible to have a socialist revolution without the presence of adequate material conditions for inaugurating an association of free individuals, contrary to what Marx had stressed in his different texts, including his latter-day anti-Bakunin text given above. Theoretically not inconceivable, Marx's thesis could only be refuted by the reality of a successful socialist revolution under Lenin's conditions. Apart from Lenin's argument about the conditions of socialist revolution, Lenin's theoretical position on socialism itself is of enormous importance in view of its lasting effect on the way socialism was conceived and practiced by the regimes which followed worldwide after the Bolshevik victory, calling themselves socialist. Lenin distinguished between socialism and communism, equating socialism and communism, respectively, with Marx's lower and higher phase of communism. Lenin also speaks of two transitions, one from capitalism to socialism, another from socialism to communism. We already saw above that for Marx, socialism and communism are equivalent terms. In this light, one could also speak of a lower and higher phase of socialism. The Leninist distinction in question, although apparently more terminological and innocent-looking, had far-reaching consequences which were far from innocent and far from what Lenin himself presumably might have expected. It became a convenient instrument for legitimizing and justifying every oppressive act of the party states from 1917 onwards in the name of socialism, which it was maintained was only a, quote, transitional phase towards communism. Thus shelving all the vital aspects of Marx's immense emancipatory project and the metamorphosing Marx's project of communism into an unalloyed utopia. The Russian case, concept and reality. Lenin. Lenin speaks of socialism basically in juridical terms, not in terms of a complex of social relations of production. For Lenin, socialism is, quote, social ownership of the means of production, which he further specifies as, quote, ownership by the working class state. Of course, Marx also speaks of the ownership of means of production in the new society as social, where society itself, and not the state, which is absent from the new society, is the owner. But for Lenin, it is the working class state which is the new owner. Here, Lenin has successfully stood Marx on his head. For Marx, socialism, even in Lenin's revised sense of the first phase of communism, is already a classless society, a, quote, union of free individuals, end quote, coming into existence after the working class, along with the last form of state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, has vanished. The proletariat, wage laborers, have been transformed into simple producers, as free individuals, and it is their society, the collectivity of free individuals, and not any state which possesses the means of production. Lenin speaks not only of the working class state, but also of what he considers to be the working class state's equivalent, the, quote, socialist state, end quote. Needless to say, this last expression is nowhere to be found in Marx. Earlier we referred to Marx's text showing that there can be no state in socialism. Lenin tries to smuggle, quote, state, end quote, into Marx's text of the Gotha critique by brazenly revising Marx's Gotha critique. This Lenin does by connecting two independent ideas in two analytically separate spaces of the text. Marx's discussion of the continuation of bourgeois right in the first phase of communism and Marx's speculation about the future of the, quote, present-day functions of the state, end quote. Lenin emphasizes the need for the existence of the bourgeois state to enforce bourgeois right in the first phase of the new society. Lenin's logic is baffling. For Marx, this first phase is inaugurated after the disappearance of proletarian rule, the last form of state. For Lenin's position, it follows that in the absence of the bourgeoisie, by assumption, the producers themselves, no longer proletarians, would have to recreate not even their old state, but the bourgeois state to enforce bourgeois right. For Marx, from the start of the new society, there are no classes and hence there is no state and no politics. Whatever bourgeois right remains in the area of distribution does not require a particular political apparatus to enforce it. It is now society itself which is in charge. One can read this textually in section 1 of the Gotha critique. Similarly, the first phase of communism, Lenin's socialism, Lenin envisages the economy as one of as one. Similarly, for the first phase of communism, Lenin's socialism, Lenin envisages the economy as one, quote, state syndicate, end quote, or one, quote, single factory, end quote, where, quote, all citizens, end quote, are transformed into, quote, hired employees of the state, end quote, with the, quote, equality of labor, equality of wages, end quote. What a contrast with Marx, who in his inaugural address of 1864 had clearly distinguished between, quote, hired labor of capitalism and, quote, associated labor. For Marx, what Lenin is talking about is simply the state itself as capitalist. Quote, insofar as it employs wage labor, end quote. So, what Lenin presents as socialism is really state capitalism, which with a quote, single state syndicate, end quote, or a, quote, single factory, end quote, as Lenin puts it, will be in Marx's terms, as we find in Capital's French version, the, quote, total national capital constituting a single capital in the needs of a single capitalist, end quote. Let us now try to see this socialism, the prototype for the 20th century, in reality. The problem begins right at the start. There is no evidence that the accession to political power by the Bolsheviks signaled a proletarian or socialist revolution, or at least its beginning, in Russia in the sense of Marx. That is, a revolution which is the outcome of the, quote, autonomous movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority, end quote, as the 1848 Manifesto affirms. The so-called October Revolution was neither initiated nor led by the proletariat. The same goes for the subsequent installation of single-party rule. In October 1917, the fate of over 170 million people was decided by a handful of non-proletarian radicalized intelligentsia, far removed from the site of the real process of production and exploitation, unelected and irrevocable by and totally unaccountable to the laboring people. Through the substitution of a whole class by a single party, power was seized under the slogan of, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, not from the provisional government, but really from the Soviets themselves, the authentic organs of laboring people's self-rule created by the self-emancipatory countrywide spontaneous popular uprising in February. This preemptive strike was perpetrated independently of and behind the back of the Congress of Soviets, depriving it of the right of maternity regarding the founding act of the new order. Revealing in this regard is Lenin's secret correspondence, expressing to his comrades in the party leadership his utter distrust and disdain of the Soviets. Quote, to wait for the Congress to meet is complete idiocy and total treachery. The Congress will give nothing and can give nothing. End quote. Undergoing a virtual radioactive decay, the Soviets as independent self-governing organs of the laborers evaporated as early as summer 1918. Quote, Soviet democracy had lasted from October 1917 to the summer of 1918, end quote. Quote, beginning with 1919, Bolshevism started to deny all the dissidents of the revolution the right to political existence, end quote. That was Victor Serge. Quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, appeared to be a reality on the 26th of October 1917, end quote, wrote an eminent historian. But, quote, it was mostly power to the Bolsheviks in those Soviets. The whole system of Soviets and executive committees was reduced to an administrative and propaganda auxiliary of the party. Deprived of power in the Soviets and in the factories, the Russian proletariat, found that the triumph of the dictatorship in its name was a very hollow victory, end quote. Daniels. The masses and the majority of Soviets representing them certainly greeted the fall of the hated old regime, but refused to have a Bolshevik hegemony. Alexander Rabinovich, in his blow-by-blow account of the events, wrote, quote, "The mass mood was not specifically Bolshevik in the sense of reflecting a desire for a Bolshevik government. As the flood of post-Kornilov political resolutions revealed, Petrograd soldiers, sailors, and workers were attracted more than ever by the goal of creating a Soviet government uniting all socialist elements. And then, in their eyes, the Bolsheviks stood for Soviet power, for Soviet democracy," end quote. There was also another important set of worker self-governing organs created in workplaces before October 1917, factory committees with their own Soviets. After having seized power from the Congress of Soviets, the Bolsheviks turned their eyes on the factory committees who were exercising workers' democracy in their workplaces and asserting control over the management. Quote, the Bolsheviks quote, "The Bolsheviks saw for the first time the danger of radical democracy confronting them, following literally Lenin's words on the sovereignty of the Soviets," end quote. That's Oscar Anweiler. The Bolsheviks now asked the trade unions, where they had a majority, to help them to subdue these self-governing organs of the workers. The trade unions obliged by simply annexing them at their lowest level. It should be clear that far from its self-conquering political power as an act of self-emancipation in Marx's 1864 sense, the Russian proletariat participated in the seizure of power, effected in the name of the proletariat by a party completely substituting itself for the proletariat, only as followers. It must be understood that by their preemptive strike against the Soviets, the Bolsheviks successfully destroyed any possibility of the unfurling bourgeois democratic revolution, so magnificently started by the quasi-totality of the country's laboring people in February, would develop over time into a genuine proletarian revolution as a process of revolution in permanence, to use the 1850 battle cry of Marx and Engels. Before the seizure of power, Lenin had stressed the need to destroy the old state apparatus and to replace it with a commune state, with freely elected and revocable officials, and to replace the police and the standing army with the armed workers. Later, Lenin had to admit that the Bolsheviks, quote, effectively took over the old apparatus of the Tsar and the bourgeoisie, end quote. Instead of officials being elected and subject to recall, there appeared bureaucrats, all party nominees and hierarchically organized from top downward. Similarly, there appeared a special police apparatus, particularly the dreaded secret police, before the end of 1917. In the same way the, quote, Red Army was fashioned, beginning in early 1918, not very differently from the professional army of a class society with ex-czarist officers in higher positions in increasing numbers. As regards industry, with the virtual liquidation of the self-managed factory communities, the principles of direction from above was imposed. Lenin now discovered that, quote, the Russian is a bad worker in comparison with the worker of the advanced nations, end quote. Hence the workers must show, quote, unquestioning obedience to the single will of the leaders of the labor process, to the one-person decision of Soviet directors, end quote. 1 year later, Lenin added, quote, Till now, we have not reached the stage where the laboring masses could participate in administration. End quote. We thus see that the regime created by October is anything but a proletarian regime. It was the party's dictatorship over the proletariat. Naturally, workers' opposition to the regime became more and more widespread and was increasingly suppressed by force. The climax was reached with the mass massacre of the Kronstadt sailors and toilers in early 1921 on the totally false charge of their collaboration with the whites, on Lenin's own testimony at the 10th Congress of the party in 1921. Isaac Deutscher writes that by 1921 to 1922, the first time since 1917, quote, the bulk of the working class unmistakably turned against the Bolsheviks. If the Bolsheviks had now permitted free elections to the Soviets, they would almost certainly have been swept from power. End quote. Isaac Deutscher. Stalin. It was Stalin who, following Lenin's lead on the concept of socialism, gave it the finished form on which the whole rationale of 20th century socialism was founded. Needless to add, Stalin totally subscribes to the Leninist identity of socialism with Marx's, quote, first phase of communism, end quote, and the Leninist idea of socialism as the transition to full communism. Stalin's inversion of Marx's materialist position goes even further than Lenin's. Whereas in Lenin, socialism is conceived in terms of the ownership of means of production, that is, in juridical terms, independently of the real relations of production, Stalin specifically makes, quote, ownership of the means of production the basis of production relations, end quote. And state ownership of the means of production is again, a la Lenin, identified with socialist ownership. Lenin's idea of citizens as hired wage laborers of the state in socialism is also taken over by Stalin. Stalin's, quote, improvement on Lenin's position here lies in his statement that given the absence of private property in the means of production in socialism, labor power has ceased to be a commodity and there are no hired wage laborers. However, the laborers receive their remuneration, quote, in the form of wage, end quote, reflecting the material incentive according to the quantity and quality of labor. But this, quote, wage under socialism is fundamentally different from wage under capitalism, end quote, because contrary to what happens in capitalism, labor power under socialism is not a commodity. In other words, wages exist and labor exists, but wage labor does not. It seems Lenin lacked this subtle logic of his follower. Finally, given the existence of two forms of ownership in the means of production, state ownership and collective farm ownership with exchange of products between them mediated by money, Stalin affirms the necessity of the existence of commodity production and hence of the law of value in socialism. However, in the absence of private ownership, socialist commodity production is totally different from commodity production under capitalism. So we have socialist commodity and socialist wage as the specific products of socialism, completely different from their counterparts in capitalism. It should be stressed that the foundation of the rationale for the existence of socialism in the new regime, underlined by Stalin following Lenin, from which all its other characteristics follow, is the alleged absence of private property in the means of production. Here, private property signifies for Lenin, quote, property of separate individuals, end quote, in the means of production. We submit that the concept of capitalist private property, in the sense of production, meaning individual private property, and correspondingly the capitalist as individual owner of capital, is pre-Marxian. As a juridical category, it is as old as the Roman law taken over later by bourgeois jurisprudence. This is the juridical form in which capital appears at its beginning period. But with the progress of accumulation, this form increasingly loses its relevance. Marx shows clearly that a certain stage of capitalist development, for the need of increasing accumulation of capital, the quote, independent variable, end quote, in capitalist production. This form tends to be largely inadequate, and there appears increasingly, as is seen in the rise of share capital, what Marx calls, quote, directly social capital in opposition to private capital, end quote, together with the, quote, associated capitalist, end quote. This signals, quote, the abolition of private property within the limits of the capitalist mode of production itself, end quote. However, Marx does not speak only of individual private property and the means of production. In his work, we also read about another kind of private property largely left aside by the Marx readers. In this second and more important sense, private property and the means of production exists as property of the few in the face of non-property of the great majority who are compelled to sell their labor power in order to live. In this sense, the objective conditions of labor are, quote, private property of a part of society, end quote. It is then class property. This is the sense which appears in the assertion of the Communist Manifesto that communists could sum up their theory in a single expression, quote, abolition of private property, quote, and the latter is explicitly used in the sense of, quote, disappearance of class property, end quote. The same idea reappears in Marx's address on the 1871 Commune. Quote, the Commune intended to abolish that class property which makes the labor of the many the wealth of the few, end quote. Hence, even with the juridical abolition of individual private property, if the great majority continues to earn its living by exchange of labor power against a wage or salary, this would signify that private property continues to exist as, quote, class property, end quote. It is not with working class state property, but only with society's direct appropriation of the conditions of production, implying necessarily the disappearance of the wage system, that private property finally goes out of existence. Only then does capitalism end. The idea of socialism as the lower phase of and transition to communism, based on public, mainly state ownership of the means of production and wage labor, and with the state form under a single party introduced by Lenin and perfected by Stalin, with the additional introduction of commodity production, remain the central idea of socialism, accepted uncritically by the rulers of the whole system of 20th century socialism across their globe and their international sympathizers. In this ironclad frame of socialism, state substitution for society and parties substituted for working class totally. It should be clear that this socialism has nothing in common with Marx's socialism, which is not transitional. It should be clear that this socialism has nothing in... Jesus Christ. It should be clear that this socialism has nothing in common with Marx's socialism, which was not transitional but equivalent to communism, a society of free and associated individuals with social ownership of the means of production and without state commodity production or wage labor. The Soviet Union was not considered socialist by its rulers till the late 1930s. Until then, it was considered a proletarian dictatorship. The victory of socialism was pronounced on the basis of the fulfillment of the second five-year plan that spanned from 1933 to 1937, showing 98.7% of the means of production coming under state and cooperative/collective ownership. The party declared that, quote, in our country, the first phase of communism, socialism, has been basically realized, end quote. The basic structure of this socialism remained more or less the same till the end of the regime. And only towards the end, with the introduction of relative freedom of opinion and expression, do we start to learn the real nature of this socialism from the internal witnesses of the regime. Thus, an eminent Soviet economist of the period wrote, quote, "Removed from direct administration and disposal of social ownership, having no influence on the system of remuneration, and participating in no way in the distribution of national income and produced product," end quote, the Soviet workers, quote, "perceived such state ownership as alien and not their own," end quote. Batenko. Similarly, the doyen of labor economics underlined, quote, "The state ownership was neither public nor socialist. Surplus labor and the corresponding surplus value belonged not to the people or to those who generated them. Profit was appropriated by the state. The directors of enterprises hired labor power in the name of the state. Wages in these conditions were, as in any capitalist society, the transformation form..." I gotta reread that whole sentence. "Surplus labor and the corresponding surplus value belonged not to the people or to those who generated them. Profit was appropriated by the state. The directors of enterprise hired labor power in the name of the state. Wages in these conditions were, as in any capitalist society, the transformed form of the value of labor power as a commodity. It is in this situation of apathy enveloping millions and, quote, exhausting all motivational basis, end quote, as another economist observed, that the, quote, standard socialist toiler, a producer of 70 years of Soviet rule, has worked." China and Mao, concept and reality. Mao Zedong proclaimed that, quote, "the salvos of the October Revolution brought Marxism-Leninism to China," end quote. And he characterized his party as, quote, "the Bolshevized Communist Party," end quote. Materially, China was even more backward than pre-October Russia. China's revolution, abstracting from its anti-imperialist character, was essentially a peasant war led by the Communist Party of China, directed against the pre-capitalist social order. The Communist Party of China under Mao, unlike the Bolsheviks under Lenin, came to represent China's great majority, firmly rooted in the country's rural laboring masses. The supposed leadership by the proletariat was more theoretical and ideological than real, the party having only tenuous links with the industrial working class. In fact, Mao wrote, quote, "The more backward a country is, the easier is its passage to socialism," end quote. Mao was even inclined, like the 19th century Russian populists, to think that the Chinese Revolution could, quote, "avoid the capitalist path in order to reach socialism directly," end quote. According to the regime's spokespersons, the Communist Party of China's victory in 1949 meant the triumph of the new democratic revolution, accomplishing the anti-feudal and anti-imperialist tasks. The subsequent period until the end of the first five-year plan of 1953 to 1957 was a transition period of, quote, "socialist construction," end quote. From 1956 to 1957 on, China was called a socialist country. Remaining well within the Leninist tradition, Mao considered socialism as the lower phase of and the transition to communism. About the nature of the Chinese society for the period beginning with the late 1950s, Mao is ambiguous. Thus, in two texts separated by a few months, he speaks curiously of, quote, "socialist relations of production," end quote, in February, and of, quote, "proletarian dictatorship," end quote, in October as existing in China. Referring positively to Stalin, Mao affirms, reversing Marx's materialist position, like Stalin before him, that the, quote, system of ownership is the basis of the relations of production, end quote. Again, following Stalin, Mao proclaimed the establishment of socialism in China on the basis of the abolition of the individual private ownership in the means of production, correctly taking account of the existence of commodity production and wage system in China's, quote, socialist reality. Mao, unlike Stalin, did not resort to subterfuges to hide their incompatibility with socialism in Marx's sense. Mao stated, quote, China is a socialist country. At present, our country practices the commodity system, an 8-grade wage system, and the wage system is unequal, and in all this scarcely different from the old society. The difference is that the system of ownership has changed, end quote. Mao also asserted, going beyond even Lenin, the, quote, existence of classes and class struggle, end quote, insisting on the latter's, quote, protracted and sometimes violent character, end quote, under socialism, which is also in quotes. This sharpening class struggle included the struggle within the Communist Party of China itself against the, quote, capitalist roaders, end quote, through a series of, quote, cultural revolutions, end quote. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution began with a lot of fanfare on the initiative of the, quote, chairman in person, end quote. The 16-point decision proclaimed the need, quote, for the masses to liberate themselves, end quote. Here, undoubtedly, Mao is in advance of the Bolsheviks, in whose writing such a clearly stated emancipatory message for the laboring people is difficult to come by. The nearest for them was the slogan, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, whose rapid liquidation in reality we have seen. The, quote, 16 articles of August 1966 called for a system of general elections like that of the Paris Commune. However, that was not how things turned out. Within a very short period, Mao himself rejected the attempt made in Shanghai to follow faithfully the example of the Paris Commune. Mao favored rather the military-dominated revolutionary committees. Quote, whatever may have been Mao's intention at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, in the end, Mao settled for the re-establishment of a presumably ideological rectified party and a presumably reformed state bureaucracy, end quote. Meisner. Far from establishing a system of election and recall at all levels of administration, all functionaries continued to be nominated. Finally, the old bureaucratic machinery emerged from the Cultural Revolution almost intact, as in Russia after October 1917. Speaking in general, as regards the pretension of having proletarian dictatorship and then socialism, the reality showed that the laboring people of China, as in Russia earlier, had no role in the fundamental decisions and the enforcement of those decisions affecting their own lives. This was the exclusive privilege of the party leadership, the, quote, task of the masses. How condescending the term became in the communist movement was to follow the instructions from above. Going beyond the Russian experience, it was a single individual, Mao, who was the ultimate reference point. Whether it was the system of, quote, people's communes or the launching of the great proletarian cultural revolution, the initiative came from the, quote, chairman in person. In a society supposed to be marching towards communism, every move was centered on following the chairman's, quote, latest instructions. What a contrast between the emphasis on Mao being the, quote, great teacher, leader, supreme commander, great helmsman, end quote, and Marx's self-emancipatory perspective of the, quote, proletariat organized as the ruling class, end quote, let alone of socialism as the, quote, association of free individuals, end quote. Conclusion: the relevance of Marx. It appears that the revolutions of the last century that claimed to be socialist were really all minority revolutions in the name of the majority. Though we discussed only two specimens of 20th century socialism above, it would not be difficult to show that the pattern that emerges from these two applies mutatis mutandis to all the members of 20th century socialism. To go back to a remarkable text by Engels, quote, "Even when the majority participated in these revolutions, this participation was only in the service of a minority. Because of this participation and because of the unopposed attitude of the minority acquired the impression that it was the representative of the whole people." End quote. All these societies have been, quote, state socialists, to use an oxymoron from the point of view of Marx. The state, quote, entoiling, enmeshing the living civil society like a boa constrictor, end quote, instead of society, quote, reabsorbing the state power, end quote, and in the process, quote, perfecting the state machinery instead of throwing off this deadening incubus, end quote. The theoretical ground and justification in advance of this enslaving system one already finds in the anti-emancipatory reading of Marx's Gothic critique by Lenin in his apparently libertarian brochure, State and Revolution, where the two fundamental instruments for enslaving the human individual, the state and wage labor, are explicitly made to appear in the lower phase of communism, misinterpreted as the, quote, transition to communism. It is no wonder that this is about the only text of Marx on the future society with its division. It is no wonder that this is about the only text of Marx on the future society, with its division into lower and higher phase, which is the constantly mentioned reference point for spokespersons of the party states, to show the concordance of their socialism with the socialism envisaged by Marx. Inasmuch as the two-phase division could easily be manipulated, given Lenin's particular reading, to justify the existence of state, commodity production, and wage labor in the first phase, seen as only the transition to, quote, full communism. Indeed, the practice of 20th century, quote, socialism has been a vast exercise in the enslavement of the human individual, whose emancipation was the ultimate goal of the socialist revolution as envisioned by Marx. The situation of the individual in the future association in Marx's different texts does not find much echo in the discussion on socialism by the partisans of 20th century socialism. Marx's relevant discussion appears in his texts beginning as early as 1843 to 1844, dealing with the problem of the individual's alienation in commodity capitalist society. In the Communist Manifesto of 1848 appears the essence of his position, quote, "Freedom of each is the condition of the freedom of all," end quote. Marx's basic criterion for judging a society was the extent to which the individual was free in the society bereft of alienation and the constraints of labor and division of labor imposed on the laboring individual from outside. Marx's 1859 characterization of all human evolution up to now as, quote, the prehistory of human society, precisely refers to the inhuman situation in which the individual has been subordinated to an alien external power, which has prevented the, quote, development of all the human powers as such, end quote. There is a remarkable passage in Marx's 1857 to 1858 manuscripts summing up the evolution of the status of the laboring individual through three stages. Quote, "The relations of personal dependence, first wholly natural, are the first social form in the midst of which human productivity develops. but only in reduced proportions and in isolated places. Personal independence based on material dependence is the second great form, only within which is constituted a general social metabolism made of universal relations, faculties, and needs. Free individuality based on the universal development of individuals and their domination of their common social productivity as their own social power is the third stage. The second creates the conditions of the third." End quote. The remarkable fourth section of the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, carries over from the 1844 manuscripts the central theme of the alienation of the individual under commodity production, and opposes it to the de-alienated association of free individuals. In the same book, Marx refers to the transformation of capital's private property into, quote, individual property under the future association of the free individuals. Again, Marx's famous discussion of necessity and liberty in the manuscript of the third volume of Capital is precisely built around the, quote, socialized individual in free association. This whole emancipatory message has been conspicuously absent from the reality of, quote, socialism of the last century. The only human and humane alternative to the inhuman reign of capital is socialism, the, quote, association of free individuals as Marx envisaged it.